Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print offered by Mr. Buck of Colorado. Page 6, line 2, strike and. Page 6, line 6, strike the period.
The gentlelady from Texas reserves a point of order.
And insert and. Page 6, insert after line 6, the following is not and has not been a member of a criminal street gang as defined in subsection A of section 521 of Title 18 United States Code, and has not participated in the activities of a criminal street gang, knowing or having reason to know that such activities will promote, further, aid, or support the illegal activity of the criminal gang. Page 6, line 17, insert before the comma the following, except with regard to subparagraph E. Page 6, insert after line 25 the following. Consideration of certain evidence. For purposes of paragraph 1E, the Secretary may consider any and all credible evidence of membership or participation in a criminal street gang, including evidence obtained from a state or federal database, used for the purpose of recording and sharing activities of alleged gang members across law enforcement agencies.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I thank the chair. This amendment is very simple. It requires that aliens not receive amnesty if they are a gang member. Time and again during debate in the Judiciary Committee, my Democrat colleagues have stated that they do not think criminals, gang members, and others who threaten public safety should get green cards. Sadly, their own bill text does not ensure that. My amendment ensures that no gang members can get the Democrats' amnesty. Criminal gangs are a scourge on our communities, preying on vulnerable populations while committing a vast array of criminal acts. I, having served in law enforcement for 25 years, and I'm sure my colleagues from both sides of the aisle who have served in law enforcement would agree with me that gang membership is a sign and really a cancer of criminal activity in a community. Often the violent acts that we see in Chicago are the results of criminal gangs fighting over turf and to sell drugs or to commit other crimes. We have seen the same type of activity in New York City with the mob. We've seen the same type of activity in Los Angeles. Very few major cities in this country can boast, if any, frankly, that they don't have criminal gang activity, which is tearing at the very fabric of that community. In rural Colorado, we have gang activity also, and in rural America. Sometimes it is part of the motorcycle gangs that we see. Sometimes it is the gangs from the inner cities that are fighting over turf in the rural parts of our country. But gang membership is something that we should all agree is not something that we're going to tolerate. It yields higher crime rates. It is the cause of much damage in our country. And to think that when I listen to the other side talk about dreamers and how much they contribute to our society, and they always point to a young person who has achieved great things, gone to college and is doing wonderful things for the community. The flip side of that coin is we need to make sure that those who are committing these crimes and those who are gang members and who are aspiring to commit crimes and who are assisting others in committing crimes don't get the same privileges as those who the Democrats want to reward for having been brought to this country at a very young age and having done great things since getting here. So I would ask my colleagues to give serious consideration to this and to pass this amendment, just as a sign that this bill is not going to allow those who have gone astray, who have committed crimes, who are members of gangs whose function, whose whole existence is to undermine the rule of law in our society. And I would ask for those, my colleagues on the Democrat side, to give this consideration and to agree that this is not the kind of behavior that we're going to tolerate in this country, and we're certainly not going to welcome it in people who have come here illegally or have been brought here illegally, and who have grown up in this country and who, through circumstances beyond their control, have received the sympathy and really the benefit from the Democrat Party. Those folks who have fit in that category, but who have joined gangs, will not receive the same benefits as others. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Madam Chair, I withdraw my point of order.
The gentlelady withdraws her point of order. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes herself to note that I must oppose this amendment. As was mentioned before, the effect of the amendment would really be to frustrate the legislative recommendations that are an investment in human infrastructure, the people who keep our economy strong and our communities vibrant. By providing a path to permanent residence for Americans, dreamers, essential workers, including farm workers and others, to keep our country running, the United States will benefit from the resulting economic gains really for decades to come. This amendment would dilute that investment and diminish those economic benefits, and that alone is enough to oppose this amendment. But this is also a wolf in sheep's clothing, because we're meeting here today to mark up a budget reconciliation proposal, not to have a policy debate on immigration. This is about money and investments in our country. Having said that, I will note that the language in the bill about eligibility comes from the Bipartisan Senate DREAM Act. These criteria were previously endorsed by Senator Lindsey Graham, so they should be more than enough for all the members of this committee. I would note further that under existing law, Section 212A3 II, any unlawful activity with no waiver can be a grounds for disqualification, and that would include criminal gang activity. So with that, I would yield back the balance of my time, urge a no vote on the amendment. Do additional members wish to be heard? Mr. McClintock, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I have to disagree completely. I do agree with you. This is making an investment, among other things, in gang members. The gangs don't need our investments. They're getting plenty from the Mexican crime cartels. When I was on the border a few months ago, one Border Patrol agent, this was in the Rio Grande Valley, told me of confronting a mother who just brought her 5-year-old son on this perilous 2,000-mile trail of terror from the Triangle countries to the U.S. border. He said, "Why would you expose your son to this kind of danger?" And she says, "To escape the gangs and get him a better education." And the Border Patrol agent said to her, "Don't you understand that the gangs that you think you're escaping are already here? That your son's going to be placed in a school where he doesn't speak the language, doesn't understand the culture, and the first place he's going to turn for comfort, acceptance, and protection are the very gangs you think you're trying to escape." Now, the cartel charges thousands and thousands of dollars to traffic illegals. They arrive deeply in debt to the cartels. Many of these migrants are forced to discharge their debt as indentured servants. Indentured servants, that's another way of saying modern slavery. And how are these debts enforced? Well, the gangs enforce them. We heard that directly from FBI Director Wray before this very committee earlier this year in this room. Gangs are embedded in these migrant communities and are as much a bane to them as they are to American communities. So why wouldn't we stop them at the border if we can? Why wouldn't we deport them as soon as they are identified if we can? And why in the world would we give them legal residency and an expedited path to citizenship? These are precisely the cartel agents who are facilitating the human trafficking on a mass scale, terrorizing and preying on migrants and enforcing modern slavery, indentured servitude, on our own shores 150 years after the 13th Amendment. I find it ironic that we have colleagues who are outraged that slavery was practiced in this country a century and a half ago, but turn a blind eye to the practice of slavery today enforced by the criminal gangs. Nothing speaks more clearly of the motives and intentions of the Democrats than their opposition to this amendment. The Mexican crime cartels are actively promoting and facilitating the mass illegal migration that's now flooding our southern border. The gangs are how the cartels make hundreds of millions of dollars from this human trafficking. This amendment tries to stop this terrible and tragic cycle of human misery and human trafficking, and the Democrats are against it. Fellow Americans, for heaven's sake, connect the dots. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I understand Mr. Roy has asked to be recognized.
Yes, ma'am. Strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
I am amazed at the extent to which this committee and the majority on the committee seems poised to dismiss out of hand the amendment offered by my colleague, a common sense amendment to ensure that criminals are not granted legalization in the United States of America. Criminals, and I heard the chair talk about how this would dilute the economic benefit. I mean, this is extraordinary. As the gentleman from California just said, we literally have billion-dollar cartel organizations making hundreds of millions of dollars every year, moving human beings for profit. Last week in Bernie, Texas, I had a roundtable with my colleague, Senator Cruz, and a number of people that run nonprofit organizations. And a mom, a woman who runs one of these entities, and she runs safe houses to protect some of these little girls getting abused by cartels, presented pictures of girls with burns. I've seen videos of these threats by some terrible members of cartels that going around putting videos out to threaten them, saying they're going to come kill them. Like the stuff that is going on because our country refuses to do its job to secure the border is absolutely extraordinary. And we have criminals coming into the United States. I mean, look, 1.4 million people have been apprehended by the Border Patrol this fiscal year. That's the entire city of Dallas. Say, oh, but we're removing some of them. Oh, garbage. First of all, that number's going down. And second of all, somewhere around 700,000 to 800,000 people are in our country not appearing. They've been released or are gotaways. Now, how do we know they're gotaways? I don't know. Maybe it's because Senator Cruz and I were sitting in a scanner at a checkpoint just north of Laredo, looking at trucks go through, went down to the border where there were 33 waiting to come across, and then they sent us an image of one of the trucks they'd just gone through that had 29 human beings jammed in the back of the truck because they're coming through Laredo. And it's happening every day. Hundreds of thousands. 200,000 in August, over 200,000 in July. Well, who are these folks? How about 50 murderers fiscal year 21 to July? 50. That's on CBP's website. 969 assault, battery, domestic violence. 674 burglary, robbery. 1,389 DUIs. 1,700 for drug possession. 4,800 on illegal entry. Look, 423 sex offenses. And we simply want to have an amendment to codify and say, hey, maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't allow gang members, rapists, murderers to be given legal status in the United States of America. All of my Democrat colleagues continue to bury their head in the sand and pretend this doesn't exist. Where are my Democratic colleagues who were complaining about kids in cages? Last week when I was down in McAllen, 4,000 human beings still being held down there in facilities for 700 or 800, all while we still have hundreds of thousands pouring across our border, cartels making money, criminals coming through. And by the way, fentanyl pouring across our border. see these people? Page after page after page after page of dead Americans from opioid overdoses because fentanyl is pouring into our communities, including Austin, Texas. When are we going to do anything about this? Or are we just going to keep playing sham games with $107 billion bills and then have the parliamentarians say, oh, yeah, we'll talk about your germaneness when you say maybe Americans shouldn't have to pay $2,000 to come home. But we're not going to talk about germaneness of Amnesty in a $107 billion spending package. And then decry saying we shouldn't allow people who are committing crimes to come into the United States as an amendment and saying, oh, no, that'll be dilutive of labor. My gosh. Go get a job at the Chamber of Commerce having wide open borders while people pour across our country, enriching cartels and killing Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I understand the gentleman from Louisiana wishes to be recognized.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to comment in support of Mr. Buck's amendment and correct something that you said a few moments ago. I think you suggested that the current language of the bill makes this amendment unnecessary because the bill's language covers convictions of all crimes and therefore criminal game activity would be included. But my friend's, Mr. Buck's amendment is actually very precisely drafted. It would be a separate section so that an alien seeking adjustment of status under this section has to demonstrate that the alien, quote, is not and has not been a member of a criminal street gang and has not participated in the activities of that gang, knowing that they would be unlawful, et cetera. So the point is that this is a different standard. We would be saying that if we know that this individual who has come across the border unlawfully is or has been a member of a criminal gang, we are not first requiring his conviction. We are saying by virtue of that membership, you are not eligible to become a lawful citizen or to have your status changed or receive amnesty in this country. That is a very low bar that we should set. Look, many of us have been down to the border, as has been said. Many of us have testified in this hearing, this markup today. What we saw, what we heard with our own ears. I talked to Border Patrol officers down there in the Rio Grande Valley. They said that everyone that we saw being processed by our immigration customs officials was trafficked by the cartels, that they were brought across by these criminal gangs. And they are, as Mr. McClintock said and many others, they are being subjected to servitude when they get here. They're paying enormous fines. As Mr. Roy has seen and keeps beating the drums to point out, they are making billions of dollars because of our crazy policies that have been enacted by the Biden administration. I think this amendment is common sense. I think every constituent of ours would agree with this. We don't want dangerous MS-13 and other gang members in this country, period. And if we can identify them and we know that they are members of those dangerous gangs, that is enough. That should be enough to exclude them from this bill. And I would yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Buck.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Chair, I wanted to address a few of the issues that you raised in opposition to this amendment. One, that you talk about how the underlying bill is meant to keep our country running, is meant to make sure that we have individuals who are productive and who have been here for a period of time and through no fault of their own are in a dilemma. Madam Chair, I think it's clear that gang members don't fit into the category of what you're saying. Gang members are leeches on our society. Gang members are individuals who suck resources, desperately needed resources from our communities into dealing with the damage that they wreak on our neighborhoods. I don't think that you meant to suggest that gang members should be given these kinds of benefits.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
I appreciate that. Clearly, I mean, we know each other well, and I did not intend to imply that gang members would be welcome or would contribute to our society. I was simply referring, and I think I was not as clear as I should have been, to the section not of the matter before us, but existing law, the Immigration and Nationality Act. People are currently excludable, 212A3, where if you have reason to believe that a person would engage in unlawful activity, you are to be denied a visa. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
reclaiming my time, Madam Chair, I think that is permissive language and not mandatory language. I think it says may be excluded. I'm not sure it says that they must be excluded. And what my amendment suggests is a mandatory exclusion for individuals who are gang members. And I appreciate the chair mentioning Senator Graham. I think it is an irony of sorts that the chair and other Democrats hold Senator Graham up to be an oracle, a prophet, someone whose opinion and decisions should be respected. I did not hear that when Justice Gorsuch was confirmed, and I did not hear that when Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed, or Justice Coney Barrett was confirmed. And I think it is a little ironic that the chair and other Democrats are now pointing to Senator Graham as someone who should have the last word on some of these issues. I do think that going back to the original amendment, I think it is important that we exclude criminal gang members from green cards in the United States. And I thank the gentleman from Louisiana for yielding.
I yield back the remainder of the time.
Gentleman yields
Yield back.
Who do other members wish to be heard on this? Mr. Biggs, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
You move to strike last word. Thank you, Madam Chair. I support this amendment. There are two things that the chair said I thought were interesting, and first of all was that we should be debating the budget, but not really get into the policy. But this whole A&S that we're talking about is an amnesty policy. So that's why we got kind of wrapped around the axle there on germaneness. I mean, we're talking about amnesty as a critical component of what we're considering of $107 billion of a reconciliation package. The other thing is, I would have sworn that I thought I heard the chair say that that not excluding gang members from the bill would frustrate the purposes of the bill, something to that effect. I could be getting that wrong. But nonetheless, here we sit, and I want to go back to a young man named Grant Ronnebeck, who was 19 years old, I believe, working at a convenience store, an individual who had a felony conviction, had been deported, was back there. He bought a pack of cigarettes, didn't feel like he was getting his change back quick enough, pulled a gun out and shot Grant point blank in the head, killing him. That is part and parcel why I have to support this amendment. I do not understand this notion that we have got to somehow turn our collective eyes the other way when you have a known member of a criminal street gang and they want to enter the country. We're talking about somebody who's entering illegally that we catch, and now we're vetting, and we determine that they are a criminally violent individual. And we're saying, well, good grief, we can't exclude somebody like that. That really, I can't imagine. Have we gotten to that point in America where the majority of Americans are going to say, well, we can't ask these questions. We can't exclude. I would suggest to you that the vast majority of Americans would be rolling their eyes and truly not understand why there's opposition from anyone about this very common sense, very rational amendment. Our job as government is to protect the rights of our citizens and those who are legally in this country. This amendment would do that. Defeat of this amendment would not do that. And with that, Madam Chair, I urge everyone to vote in favor of the Buck Amendment, and I'll yield back.
Who else seeks recognition on this amendment? Hearing none.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck
Mr.
is recognized.
Fitzgerald?
Mr. Buck is recognized. For what purpose does Mr. Buck seek recognition?
I had a parliamentary inquiry, but I'm happy to do it after debate of this bill.
Okay, well, are there any further amendments? Mr. Fitzgerald?
Yeah, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wanted to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support what Mr. Buck is doing here. The Biden administration, they halted the construction on the border wall, which makes no sense to me, still does not. They brought back the catch and release and then got rid of the remain in Mexico policy, which it's only when the courts step in that we kind of figure out where we're at now. And, the administration's rhetoric and the policies are what have really kind of now enhanced this discussion we're having right now about fentanyl and the seizures. And all you have to do is pick up the paper and you'll read about one article after another in which fentanyl is now being found in different types of settings. We just had a major bust that happened right in our backyard. And then it was 1,000 pounds of fentanyl was seized at the border in June, and that's more than they had ever seen before. So on my visits down there, it's certainly something we saw. I also want to bring up another item that kind of plays into what Mr. Buck is trying to do here. The Stopping Overdoses of Fentanyl Analogs Act to permanently designate fentanyl-related substances as a Schedule I drug. I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but that is set to expire on October 22nd. So again, this is something that should be addressed. And I mean, right now, it sounds like the majority, all they want to talk about, this isn't germane and that isn't germane. But the fact of the matter is the drug overdoses are continuing nationally. We're seeing it here in Wisconsin. And, I think we should be ensuring that the committee is not giving these violent criminals and drug traffickers a loophole. And that's exactly what's happening now by granting them amnesty. And no one has told me definitively that that is not what is going to happen after what we're marking up today would become law. So I yield back, but this is a frustrating day, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment. All in favor? Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck? Does Mr. Buck seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have a parliamentary inquiry, and I'm happy to state it now. The inquiry is, when is the appropriate time to raise the germaneness issue of including amnesty provisions in a reconciliation bill?
That's not a proper parliamentary inquiry, but our role in the reconciliation process is not to opine on whether a provision violates the Byrd Rule of the Congressional Budget Act. I very happily leave that job to the budget experts in the House and the Senate. Our role in this process is much simpler. It is to give the Budget Committee, by September 15th, this Wednesday, our best recommendations about how to spend the resources that have been allotted to our committee in the budget resolution. The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Nay.
No.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any?
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Somebody needs to mute their microphone, and Lofgren votes no.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen?
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia?
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Deutsch?
No.
Mr. Deutsch votes no.
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Ms. Bass?
Yes, no.
Ms. Bass votes no. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Jayapal?
No.
Ms. Jayapal votes no. Ms. Stimmings?
No.
Ms. Stimmings votes no. Mr. Correa?
No.
Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Ms. Garcia?
No.
Ms. Garcia votes no. Mr. Neguse?
No.
Mr. Neguse votes no. Ms. McBath? Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes no. Ms. Dean?
No.
Ms. Dean votes no. Ms. Escobar?
No.
Ms. Escobar votes no. Mr. Jones?
No.
Mr. Jones votes no. Ms. Ross?
Ross votes no.
Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush?
Bush votes no.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Shabbat?
Aye.
Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Gomert?
Aye.
Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Buck?
Aye.
Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Gates?
Aye.
Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana? Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. Biggs votes aye. Mr. McClintock?
Aye.
Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Stubbe?
Yes.
Mr. Stubbe votes yes. Mr. Tiffany?
Aye.
Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey?
Aye.
Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy?
Aye.
Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Ms. Fishbach?
Aye.
Ms. Fishbach votes aye. Ms. Sparts?
Sparks, yes.
Ms. Sparts votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald?
Aye.
Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz?
Yes.
Mr. Bentz votes yes. Mr. Owens?
Aye.
Mr. Owens votes aye.
Madam Clerk, this is David Cicilline. How am I recorded?
Mr. Cicilline, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Cicilline
This is
votes no.
Ted Lieu. How am I recorded?
Mr. Liu, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Liu votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who have not been recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 19 ayes and 22 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does Mr. Pence seek recognition?
I have an amendment on the desk, Mr. Chair.
Clerk will report the amendment.
I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.